Today, I wanted to make a video on something a little different. A lot of channels focus on tech and gaming, and I've recently been getting a little more into tech, and I wanted to share my experience with something called Linux. Now, Linux, or GNU Linux, as some people prefer to call it, is now this is a operating system. Most are free and open source, meaning that the code is freely available for people to inspect. And there's a whole philosophy behind that open source concept. But I want to share my experience with how I got into this world and how it's really benefited my life. Now, in the summer of 2019, I had a computer, a laptop. It was a Toshiba laptop. I'll put the model and details on the screen. And this laptop, I believe it was running Windows Vista, which was a really old operating system, completely out of date. I hadn't used it in a long time, but the reason I kept it around is because this computer has a DVD player, and for me, that's still valuable. So I wanted to look into what could I do to restore this computer. So I ran a whole bunch of cleaners, deleted a whole bunch of files. I replaced the battery. I replaced the Wi-Fi card. I tried to replace as much as I could that was broken. The volume audio was broken. I replaced a whole bunch of parts, and it was already still working, but it was kind of falling apart. But thanks to replacing the parts, it's even more operational than it was before. But there was something that annoyed me because it was running Windows Vista, and so everything on that was out of date. Firefox was out of date. Chrome was out of date. I couldn't use any of the latest browsers. So I was afraid if I even tried to use this to surf the internet, I'd be risking getting a virus, at least, or having my computer exploited. At least that's the way I thought. I just didn't feel comfortable or safe using it when my browsers were so out of date. All my research suggested that there was just simply no way that I could get the latest browsers. So I did research, and the possibility of replacing the operating system altogether got into my head. And considering that this computer was kind of a throwaway laptop, I certainly wasn't going to be doing this on my main computer because I was not very technically savvy back then. And if I messed up, I was not going to be risking messing up my current computer. But for a throwaway computer, I figured I'd go ahead and experiment with replacing the operating system. I didn't even know that was a possibility till I researched Linux and Ubuntu, which was the first Linux distro that I've tried. Now, I tried running it in a virtual machine, but my computer was so old that the requirements to run a virtual machine were barely there, so it was barely operational. I couldn't use the latest Ubuntu distro in VirtualBox, so I had to just use a 32-bit version, and that seemed to work well enough. So I went ahead and I took the plunge, and I replaced Windows Vista with Ubuntu, which was a 32-bit one. It was a much older one than what was actually released at the time. Now, when I installed it, I was thrilled because here we have a 10-year-old computer. I believe I got that computer around 2008, 2009. And now it's this computer, which I thought was out of date and would never be capable of running the latest software. Here I have it running Ubuntu, and it has the latest versions of Firefox, and I could get Chromium on it. For me, it was thrilling because, in your head, when you're told that a computer's out of date, I felt like the hardware was useless. But, I didn't want to throw that computer away because it still worked. And thanks to Ubuntu, I was able to actually use it again. And I was able to feel relatively safe, using the internet on it. But I ran into a problem because I don't know if I improperly installed the codecs, or if, because it was an older version, the codecs weren't installed. But the main reason I wanted to get it working again, the DVD player, it was really having some issues. I guess I had to install the codecs, and the DVD player was having issues. It wasn't always connecting properly. I'd have to restart the computer just to get it to connect. I started having all these problems. And as I was doing research and getting into the Linux world, alongside Ubuntu, I kept hearing mentions of something called Linux Mint. So I tried running VirtualBox again, and I tried using Linux Mint, and it, unlike Ubuntu, it seemed to work better than Ubuntu did when I ran VirtualBox. So after a lot of thought, I decided, you know what? I already replaced the operating system on this once. I'm still having a few issues. I might as well go ahead and replace it with Linux Mint. And unlike with Ubuntu, the latest version of Linux Mint worked on my Toshiba. It was able to run the latest version, 64-bit this time. It worked perfectly. There were no issues. I could play DVDs. I could do everything on a normal laptop that I would do, and it's great. And I've stuck with Linux Mint ever since. And I wanted to use Linux on a more newer computer and see how well it would perform on hardware that was more modern. So I went ahead and I bought a computer that I know that we use at my job, and it's made for IT, and I know that it is a quality computer, lightweight and yet durable. It was a Dell Latitude. I bought that, and I installed Linux onto it. Now, it was a little different because usually you have to use the BIOS to install Linux, but there is some kind of secure boot on the Dell Latitudes, but I managed to get around that, and I installed Linux Mint, and that laptop has served me very well. It's actually what I'm using right now to record this audio. So Linux Mint, it served me well. Although I did have to make a switch. I've stuck with the Cinnamon desktop for a long time, but thanks to VirtualBox, I got to experiment with other distros, other desktop environments. And thanks to my experimenting, I found that XFCE desktop environment suits my needs. I found Cinnamon to be a little buggy sometimes, a little laggy, and I wanted something that was just a little more snappy. The shift to XFCE wasn't perfect, though. I had to iron out some bugs and some flaws, but once I figured out what all the issues were, XFCE has served me quite well for now. And I might not have been comfortable shifting to another desktop environment if it hadn't been for VirtualBox. I have VirtualBox operating systems for Android, Arch Linux, Debian, two Debians, Linux Lite, Manjaro, and Ubuntu, all on my desktop. I did experiment with other Linux distros, but overall, for me, I found that Ubuntu and Manjaro are also pretty solid Linux distros. The newer version of Ubuntu that would have worked better on this computer than it did on my old one. But I would have to say that if I were to do this again, then I would probably stick with Ubuntu or Manjaro if I were not to choose Linux Mint, that is. I found that overall, Manjaro is also a solid distro. That's based off of Arch Linux. It's far easier to install than Arch Linux, which I did myself for VirtualBox. After a lot of trial and error, blood, sweat, and tears, I did install it, and I'm pretty proud of that. But overall, I'm definitely think that Manjaro and Ubuntu, they're pretty solid distros in my opinion. But I doubt that I'll ever switch from Linux Mint, as long as it remains as reliable as it has always been. I believe in regards to the open source philosophy, I believe that open source is definitely a good thing. It's because of this philosophy that I've been given new options now. I don't have to stick with a Mac or a Windows. I don't have to be locked into those operating systems anymore. I have a new option, Linux. But I do believe that free and open source is good, but working and being reliable is also good. And I think Linux Mint strikes the perfect balance between free and open source and still being a reliable operating system that works. And so that's those are my thoughts on Linux Mint and the Linux world overall. I hope this has been entertaining. I always like to listen to people's stories of how they switched to Linux, why they switched to Linux. So I figured I'd put my story out there. I also hope it's helped somebody who's trying to figure out what to do with an old computer. If you're figuring out what to do with an old computer, you could try switching to Linux instead of throwing it away. And you can breathe new life into a new computer. And that's, for me, that's just incredible that it can do that. And it can. And you don't need to be an IT specialist to do it.